Introduction. The following is a three-part video which I am unable to describe or introduce properly. The subject matter of this triptych remains, ironically of course, destabilized. For now, I simply want to say that this is a project which seeks to tackle three different issues in philosophy which have been brought about by the French thinker Jasques Derrida. I will attempt to introduce them as I go along, and do my best to present them in a way which is hopefully not completely off the wall. However, I give a warning that I cannot guarantee perfect coherence in this video, and this is for a multitude of reasons. The first is that, of all philosophers, Derrida perhaps is one of the most difficult and nebulous to explain. He is notoriously hard to read, and the secondary sources attempting to explain his work are often not very helpful either. There are times where one can rather cynically say that Derrida is not even a philosopher, but a writer participating in an elaborate prank against the reader. Peter Kreeft's History of Philosophy, titled Socrates' Children, quips that reading Derrida made Peter Kreeft guarantee that he will always long to read analytic philosophy instead. However funny this may be, it must be said that much discourse around Derrida has fallen into three separate camps, each of which seem to be unreliable representations of Derrida himself. The first are men like Kreeft, who from the get-go are quick to dismiss Derrida as not real philosophy, or if they do give the time to read him, ultimately call him a nihilist or some other derogatory term and do away with him in their minds. The second group exists on the polar opposite of this, and is mostly comprised of sources written around the time of the deconstruction craze of the 1970s and 80s. These sources are quick to beatify everything ever said or done by Derrida, and are consumed with the zeal for the movement, which at the time seemed to be a revolution against a number of various oppressive ideas and institutions. The final camp is perhaps the smallest, and is comprised of those who have mixed Derrida in with the remnants of contemporary critical theory, either using him loosely or turning against him for lacking the libertine attitude required to be an intellectual today, even though the goalposts of qualifying as one are always on the move. Each of these positions concerning Derrida make trying to understand him that much more difficult, for one is never quite sure if he is reading a hater, a lover, or just a jaded ex. The second warning I must give is that, whether it is from engaging with him too much, or perhaps misunderstanding him entirely, I have taken up some of Derrida's style, which, by its nature, if there is such a thing, is very slippery and infuriating. I must admit that when it comes to strengths in my own philosophical background, perfect logical rigor and neatly defined definitions were never my strong suit. It seems that they were not Derrida's either, or rather, he realized very quickly the many risks one takes on when one imagines that he can speak so definitively. For all the criticism levied at him, it is here I believe that Derrida is actually vindicated as a true philosopher. For the only other thinker so quick to upset the status quo and infuriate those who thought that they had solid knowledge of a thing was, of course, Socrates. Finally, this video is ultimately influenced by Derrida. I do not intend to present him completely untarnished from my own reading of him. In many ways, this video is more of a tribute to the man, as best as I can make, than an easy-to-follow educational rundown of his thought. If you want to know terms and pass a test, read a Wikipedia article. But if you want to restore the strangeness of the world, what I have argued philosophy's proper role to be, then you have to let the text read you, and then you live it. Perhaps that is, in a way, the best way I can salute this great and troubling thinker, that I remain within the realm of play and difference, unable to say much, yet obligated to continue to speak. Part 1. Can we say anything more? Philosophy, if it has anything to concern itself with nowadays, is fixated on its own demise. The death of history, the death of philosophy, has been a sticking point on which much of the field's efforts have been focused, whether consciously or not. Many have claimed that this anxiety and continuous declaration that philosophy is dead has come from our inheritance of the perpetual revolutions of the modern Enlightenment. However, one can dig up any number of thinkers and find different points in which all good thought deceased. The scholastics and neo-scholastics are quick to point the finger at Occam and Descartes. The Marxist sees history dissolve under stagnant capitalism. Hegel sees all of history culminating in himself. And Nietzsche notices the decomposition of philosophy's corpse at the very beginnings of Plato. Whether philosophy truly died in the 15th or 18th century remains undetermined. However, our own age does seem to bear this concern of its death in a much graver way. Why is this? A cursory glimpse of the history of philosophy shows that our inheritance of postmodernity and beyond likely has something to do with our role as contemporary coroners. From Plato to the end of the scholastic period of the Middle Ages, philosophy had fought a brave battle against the remnants of the pre-Socratic and skeptics, and built a three-layered castle, one of metaphysical grounded truth, that this truth was knowable, and finally, that it could be communicated and understood. All three of these layers were slowly dismantled, seemingly out of nowhere. The late nominalists are the first murderers, in that their attack against the presence of universals outside of those within the mind dismantled that metaphysical truth had any real grounding. The second layer, that we could even know the truth, was attacked by the moderns, epitomized in the work of Descartes and Kant. Finally, it fell on postmodernity to deal the death blow, where the philosophy of language made it impossible to communicate the truth, even if it did exist. All of this, of course, is perhaps a false narrative, but nevertheless is definitely felt amongst the inheritors of the post-Nietzschean world. Many have claimed that the fad of deconstruction, which had been drawn from the work of Derrida, was perhaps the last step in dismantling any real attempt to rebuild the castle of truth. After Nietzsche, the death of God, after the 60s and 70s, where all institutions and truths that were once taken for granted were overturned, after years of political revolutions, social upheaval, and promised utopias of various kinds continued to bear rotten fruit, the stagnation was blamed on the death of philosophy. Another way to see this is the state of academic philosophy in general, which has often been reduced to commentary on the most niche of topics, removed from any bearing or influence outside of the discipline, and the proliferation of expertise only resulting in further detachment and lack of cohesion between thinkers. To argue unceasingly around the invisible lines of the analytic continental split, or to continuously reinvent new terms for the upcoming epoch, where philosophy has either been solved by the idealist or declared unsavable by the cynics, is only possible when all other avenues are seemingly closed off. Finally, anyone attempting to make their own contribution to philosophy must inevitably run against the vanity of vanities, that there is nothing new under the sun, and that their thought, more than likely, has already been explored by some other thinker. All of this has led to an almost constant state of identity crisis within philosophy as a whole, culminating in the question, can we say anything more? Or has philosophy exhausted its possibilities entirely? Evidence that we have run out of words seems to come not only from philosophy, but our surrounding culture, which many have claimed has grinded to such a halt that we are in a stage of a constant recycled idea, that all we have left is infatuation, nostalgia, and a continuous spiral of information given through techno-media. All of this compiles to result in a haunting silence that can be ironically heard in between the plurality of voices that come to us from advertisers, social media, and our own unsettled conscience. It seems that if philosophy has any moves left, It cannot return to its previous heyday. Those all-encompassing systems, the beautiful sandcastles that explain everything, philosophy cannot do that anymore. It must become a critique of culture, politics, and power, the only things that we have left to discuss. In the midst of all of this chaos, we can now turn more explicitly to Derrida's chief contribution, or perhaps, rather, what Derrida claims to have discovered, the already ongoing process of deconstruction. It is here that we begin to swim out into murky waters, since deconstruction seems to have garnered a negative connotation, and for many brings up feelings of exhaustion and dismay. In most of my reading, it seems that this has come due more to the followers of Derrida than Derrida himself. Deconstruction is not a method, and whatever deconstruction is, it seems to defy most easy-to-understand definitions and examples. It remains to be seen whether this is due to deconstruction being a truly unique force in the history of philosophy, or just an ever-twisting idea made up by a French charlatan. Let me then speak as plainly as possible, realizing that even what I am saying is perhaps subject to the very thing I am trying to define. Deconstruction is an interior activity within any given text. What I mean by activity is that deconstruction is not something placed upon a text, but is already a dynamic within. Therefore, it is improper to say that we can just pick up a text, like the Odyssey and Star Wars, and just begin to deconstruct it. Instead, it is better to say that something within the text and story is already at work, which is, at this moment, undermining the gestures at a stable, fixed meaning presumed by the text. And by text, we must also say that we mean something that expands beyond classical literature or books. A work of philosophy, a classic story, movies, systems of government, even bodies can become texts. We may liken a text to an ecosystem of sorts, which is composed of an interweaving of various signs, symbols, and meanings. Each of these signs is codependent on the ecosystem, and every other part of the system to provide its meaning. The trees are understood as they differ and are not vines, flowers, creeks, bugs, and sunlight. A lightsaber is not only understood by its difference from a blaster, but its connection with the Jedi, the Sith, George Lucas. The hand is to the eye, to the arm, to handshakes, to making a hitchhiker's thumb. If I have not hammered the point home enough, we may say that the text operates in the way we play a dictionary game. We look up a word to learn its meaning, only to realize the definition of that word is dependent on other words, which we in turn look up the definition to, and this process continues. However, for any text to make sense or have any discernible meaning, an appeal is usually made through hierarchical binaries, through a process of privileging, which seeks to center and stabilize meaning, but in doing so often results in the system of difference being neglected, along with certain terms being privileged over others. This privileging not only usually results in violence against terms deemed lacking or derivative, but also presents the privileged term as self-evident or primary. The activity of deconstruction, then, illumines how the privileged term does not actually have a fixed grounding by itself, but rather is dependent on the secondary term for its meaning. This, then, reveals instability within the text. This destabilizing should be considered more of a restoration than a revolution, and is within this key point which I believe has led many to make something of deconstruction which is not. Once the privileged term is shown to be dependent upon the secondary term, it is easy for many to flip-flop the roles of the terms. Let us take a deconstruction of the binary of reason and love within the text of the history of philosophy as an example. Reason, rationality, logical thinking, all these things have typically been held as privileged over love, willpower, emotion, and the passions in post-Enlightenment thought. But as many know, even the word philosophy, taken from the Greek to mean love of wisdom, is as much about love as it is finding a neat conclusion to a logical syllogism. If man had no desire, no love, no drive, there would be no reason for him to reason. This is maybe a bit pithy, but let's grant it for now. We therefore find that the privileging of reason over love is now destabilized, and reason alone is not self-evidently meaningful or grounded. What now has to be fought against is our natural inclination to pull love as our new primary term and sequester reason to the sideline. Instead, there is a tension held between the two terms and their interdependence within the text. Deconstruction thus restores. It does not cause a revolt. Within this restoration, then, a play between the terms now becomes possible. Deconstruction is not without its criticisms, but as we have established, the end of deconstruction, if there is such a thing, is not the complete demolishing of a text, nor does it seek a reversal of the privileging terms. Any attempt to impose from the outside deconstruction, or leave the text in a mangled state beyond comprehension, or invite new positions of power and privilege, are distortions of deconstruction. More valid criticism of this activity and approach to philosophy comes from a variety of sources much more nuanced than someone yelling at the clouds that deconstruction is just nihilistic. For example, many attentive readers will notice a Hegelian inclination being gestured at once two terms are set in opposition against each other. How does deconstruction differ from Hegelian dialectics, which would resolve the tension as a synthesis? Furthermore, what does the end result of so-called play even look like? If deconstruction is an activity within a text, what brings it into motion? Where does the privileging of terms take place, and why does it seem to occur so naturally? If deconstruction does somehow avoid Hegelian synthesis, and the two terms are shown to be interdependent yet somehow separate, has anything really shifted? In an interview on deconstruction and the philosophy of religion, Derrida seems to imply that certain things are not subject to deconstruction, such as justice. If that is the case, what determines a text or a concept which is not up for deconstruction? The results of deconstruction in general have destabilized and questioned the confident gesturing of previous schools of thought which appealed to terms such as being, form, goodness, and intelligibility, and have shown them to be dependent and not self-evident. But if this is the case, why is it that deconstruction as an activity already seems to rely on difference and the process of becoming to be self-evident in order for it to take place? Have we secretly swapped our metaphysical assumptions behind our back in an act of blissful self-contradiction? These and many more questions I leave for you, the viewer, to dwell on. However, I will preface by saying that much like the Hegelian dialectic, deconstruction seems to invite questioning and contradiction, which rather than challenging its foundation, only adds to the process as a whole. Much like Socrates, who invited his students into more questioning, Derrida seems to welcome gleefully anyone attempting a deconstruction of deconstruction, since it only seems to add to the plurality of difference within the ecosystem of texts. Part 2. Whither Philosophy, The Specters That Haunt Zombies, Devouring History. Having established the main elements of deconstruction, we can now return to philosophy's obsession with its own death, and attempt to view the history of philosophy as a whole as also a text in which deconstruction is taking place. It would be almost impossible to talk about the history of ideas without making reference to the thought of Hegel. But to go through his thought would be a video series in itself. It is just worthwhile mentioning here that many read Hegel in a way that has brought about our contemporary concern with the end of history. I'd argue, though, that this contribution, which is often attributed to Hegel, actually draws from outside of philosophy, in the realm of Christian theology, which had significantly influenced Hegel's thought. Henri de Lubac brings out that Christianity had a significant impact on how people began to view time and history. In fact, our current conception of history as a whole seems to come from the Christian worldview. Previously, it was much more common to view time and history in the ancient world as cyclical and repetitive. We may think of older pagan notions of time, which believed that the world itself had been created, destroyed, and recreated over and over again, with each new iteration resulting in things becoming worse. Further evidence of this comes from Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence of the same, which either knowingly or unknowingly was a similar reapplication of a pagan understanding of time in philosophical language. While we do not want to broad brush all of human culture before the advent of Christianity, this was a common way of seeing time. After Christianity takes place as the main religion of the West and eventually expands across the world, history shifts from a repetition of destruction and renewal to rather an anxious awaiting of the second coming of Christ. History therefore changes from a seemingly arbitrary sequence of events which repeat themselves and rather becomes the story of the coming of the Messiah and the awaiting of the end of the age, where a new heaven and a new earth will appear. Many have claimed that this apocalyptic expectation recorded in the Christian tradition is presented again in the writing of Hegel as well as his inheritors, such as Marx. Even after much of our culture has seemed to agree with Nietzsche's cry about the death of God, our perception of history is haunted, as Derrida would say. Christian and pagan ideas and influences do not go away quietly. It is for this reason that even when many do not believe in a second coming of Christ, they declare that there will be a death or end of history, whether it come in the perfect utopian political system or negatively in the form of an ecological end of the world. It is here that we now see a deconstruction of sorts taking place within the history of ideas. If history is a text, we may begin to see a privileging of finality, death, and the end at the expense of repetition, life, and the beginning. This has manifested itself in continuous doomsday predictions of philosophy as a whole, and the repeated attempts of many to solve history and politics. Derrida's book, Specters of Marx, gives us a good example of this, in which, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the capitalist West celebrated that neoliberalism had finally conquered its enemies, only to be haunted by the so-called ghosts of Marx, such as the large gap of income inequality, class struggle, and the tensions brought about by government intervention in the economy as a whole. In a similar way, we can say that philosophy is in a constant state of ending itself while being haunted by the ghosts of religion, both Christianity and paganism, which the pure rationality of the Enlightenment tried to suppress. Curiously, there seems to not only be a haunting of our present time by the specters of Christianity, paganism, and Marx, but also the beginnings of play between these terms, giving rise to the feeling that history has not only ended, but has also simultaneously entered a state of repetition, exemplified in internet memes, such as the famous phrase, "Nothing ever happens." This sentiment has been perpetuated by many who have found themselves exhausted in cynicism after the long repetition of corporations, politicians, and so-called internet influencers, all declaring that something new has arisen in history, only for disappointment to set in as the promised escape is just one more instantiation of what Byung-Chul Han cleverly called the inferno of the same. If we are to take from Derrida some influence here, we can say that there is in fact a double haunting of the present time. The first haunting comes in the form of the ghost, which we have already described. These ghosts are never fully present, nor are they fully absent, and for this reason they disturb and disrupt our contemporary world's claim to finality. Even if in the cultural mind the faith in Christianity has disappeared, or the Marxist critique of global capitalism has failed, these remain as ghosts, haunting modern man in his dreams, asking him if history really has been solved, if the plight of the poor and the marginalized really has been adequately responded to, and whether the end of history and philosophy truly has been achieved. The other haunting of our present time comes from what I will call zombies. If a ghost is a spiritual presence, which simultaneously lacks a physical presence, and thus contains both presence and absence, the zombie does this in a reversed way, by putting forth a physical presence while lacking any spirit. The clearest example of zombies within our own time are the various institutions laying claim to finality, which continue to operate long after the spirit which inspired belief in them has departed. We can think of the various government bureaucracies which lumber on in spite of themselves, or brands and companies which sell products under the guise of obtaining a new lifestyle, only to be in reality providing a mere physical good. Another example of zombification comes in the form of the prevalent use of artificial intelligence within the internet space. AI produces language which is convincing to us when we read it, yet lacks an intentional author who understands the text being written. It is held now that it is very likely, if not already happening, that a large number of websites and accounts are in fact run by AI. If this is a case, the internet is quickly becoming a gravesite haunted by various zombies simulating conversations with each other, which ironically often perpetuate more talk between other zombies, be it fake reviews of products to inflate appeal, or social media accounts spouting political rhetoric to influence the few human accounts still active. These various hauntings of our time seem to be the process of deconstruction realized, or more properly said, as deconstruction continues to take place, various specters appear to show that things are not as stable as we first thought them to be, and that the perception of time, history, and philosophy itself are continuously being destabilized, leaving open room for previously oppressed terms to be brought forward again, and the system of privileging towards a final end being broken apart so as to leave open room for play between terms and ghosts. Part 3. The concluding, yet open, postscript of the other. It may be surprising to some that Derrida, when asked to describe the disposition of deconstruction, if such a thing could be said, responded with the words, "Viens, oui, oui." In English, "Come, yes, yes." These are the words of someone welcoming another into their home, but the relation between hospitality and deconstruction is not immediately obvious. As we have established, deconstruction is not simply the destruction of a text, but the revealing of tensions present within. Through the process of privileging, one term within a binary is elevated as primary, while another is relegated and sequestered away. Deconstruction reveals that the privileged term is not self-sufficient, but dependent upon what it excludes, dependent on the surrounding difference, which allows a new relation between the terms to emerge. This process occurs not only within individual texts, but within the larger texts of history and philosophy. Our current age is haunted by religious and philosophical specters that have been supposedly overcome, while simultaneously threatened by the arrival of new forms of promised closure, the zombies, the systems that project finality without meaning, causing us to enter the repetition of ending. Philosophy, then, is stuck in a state of dying. All of this, then, returns us to the question of which we began with. Is there anything left for us to say? Perhaps Derrida's response would not be an answer, but, as many philosophers do, another question. What makes us think that the task before us is simply to say something new? What if the possibility of something truly new does not emerge through the creation of more zombies, presuming another system, another foundation, or another final answer which supposedly solves our problems? What if it begins instead with hospitality, with preparing ourselves and our language so that the other may arrive? In this way, deconstruction appears as a close relative to the via negativa, the way of mysticism which seeks to prevent idolatry from occurring. How are we to welcome the other if we have set the conditions for their arrival, if we have named them before they have introduced themselves? Derrida then would argue that deconstruction seems to have an ethic within it, tied to bringing about true hospitality to the other. Deconstruction asks questions about what has been excluded or underprivileged within a text, and so subsequently resists the artificial closing or grounding that so many systems rely on. Deconstruction brings forth the ghosts of any text, and within the text of history, this means the unfinished obligation of justice and the continuous state of waiting for what Derrida calls the messianic without messianism, that we are to await the coming of the other, the arrival of justice, by resisting our tendency to totalize them with concepts and names, allowing for the event of something truly new to come upon us. It is therefore with great irony that I have to end this video, even with deconstruction continuously resisting any claims to finality. My questions surrounding the end are in fact haunted themselves. My language, which I have constructed around the work of Derrida, almost inevitably is subject to the very thing I have tried to describe. This video itself is just another text, unraveling through deconstruction. There is perhaps no suitable final word, no satisfying conclusion to be had, and I think Derrida wanted it that way. I have tried my best to present his work and its influence on my own thought in this video, but I am fully aware of many misunderstandings and misreadings on my own part. The only justice I can really give is to say that I cannot give complete justice to the work of Jasques Derrida. If this is the case, then, I would like to at least leave a few questions for Derrida. We have entertained the question of whether there is anything left to say, and we have seen how deconstruction has brought this about within the text of history. Now, can we dare to ask a new set of questions? These questions come about from actually a student of Derrida, who I will present in my next video. But in preparation, let us ask this. This coming of the other that Derrida speaks about, of justice, which claims deconstruction is preparation for, how are we to really allow the other in if deconstruction continuously resists all of our attempts at conceptions and names? Another question is, what if we were to receive the name of the other? How would we not immediately negate it due to the radical suspicion deconstruction seems to take on? Why must deconstruction refer to the arrival of the other as dependent upon the future? Are we to negate the possibility that the other has actually already arrived and has in fact given us language on how to address it? One final question, if there is such a thing. If the other, for whom deconstruction has always kept the door open for, what if the other was not just another onto-theological interpretation? What if the other was God, beyond being, the saturated phenomena of agape, shattering the horizon of our absurdity? Would we still say with Derrida, as we stand at the door and hear the knock, "Come, yes, yes, viens, oui, oui"? Are you also awaiting the arrival of the other, the coming of justice into a destabilized and haunted world? Like, subscribe, and wander around your local parking garage.